the annual International Artificial Intelligence Research Summit in San Jose, California, brought together hundreds of scientists, university professors, engineers, technology executives, and graduate students from around the world. Everyone was eager to witness the unveiling of a revolutionary new artificial intelligence architecture that many experts believed would shape the next generation of computing. Sitting quietly in the last row of the conference hall was an 80-year-old man wearing a faded gray wool sweater, simple brown trousers, worn leather shoes, and thick reading glasses. Resting beside his chair was an old leather briefcase filled with handwritten notebooks instead of a laptop. Several young researchers smiled politely, assuming he was a retired visitor or perhaps someone's grandfather who had wandered into the wrong session. One graduate student whispered, "I don't think he realizes this is the AI keynote." Another laughed softly. "Maybe he's looking for the history museum." The elderly man simply smiled and continued reading his notebook without responding. Moments later, the conference host walked onto the stage to introduce the keynote speaker. Before beginning, however, she suddenly looked toward the back of the auditorium, stepped down from the stage, and walked directly to the old man. The entire audience watched in puzzled silence as she warmly shook both of his hands. "Professor Arthur Bennett," she said with unmistakable respect, "we've been hoping you would come." The room fell completely silent. Only then did hundreds of researchers realize that the quiet old man in the worn sweater was the pioneering computer scientist whose mathematical framework, published more than 40 years earlier, had quietly become one of the foundations upon which much of modern artificial intelligence had been built. Resting inside his old leather briefcase were the original handwritten research notebooks that began it all, along with one sealed letter from the mentor, who had once told him that the greatest scientific discoveries are remembered not because they make people famous, but because they make future generations possible. The convention center in San Jose buzzed with excitement as researchers from universities, technology companies, and laboratories around the world gathered for the opening day of the International Artificial Intelligence Research Summit. Giant digital displays showcased the latest breakthroughs in machine learning, robotics, neural networks, and autonomous systems. Engineers discussed billion-parameter models over coffee while graduate students eagerly waited for the keynote presentation that promised to introduce a revolutionary new AI architecture expected to influence the next decade of computing. Nearly everyone in the building carried the latest laptop, tablet, or augmented reality device. Quietly walking through the crowd was an 80-year-old man dressed very differently from everyone else. Professor Arthur Bennett wore a faded gray wool sweater, neatly pressed brown trousers, polished but well-worn leather shoes, and thick reading glasses that had clearly accompanied him for many years. Instead of carrying a sleek computer bag, he held an old leather briefcase whose corners had softened with age. He moved slowly toward the main auditorium and chose a seat in the last row, placing the briefcase carefully beside his chair before taking out a small handwritten notebook and a fountain pen. Several graduate students sitting nearby glanced at one another with curiosity. One whispered, "He doesn't even have a laptop." Another smiled, "Maybe he's someone's grandfather waiting for the ceremony to finish." A third quietly laughed. "He picked the wrong conference. This is artificial intelligence, not computer history." Arthur heard every word but simply smiled as he continued making notes in his little notebook. A young volunteer wearing a conference badge soon approached him. "Good morning, sir," she said kindly. "Can I help you find the correct event?" Arthur looked up with a warm smile. "I believe I've already found it." The volunteer glanced at the conference schedule. "Today's keynote is highly technical," she explained politely. "Most of the audience will be researchers." Arthur nodded. "That's exactly why I'm here." Assuming he was simply an enthusiastic retired visitor, she smiled and wished him a pleasant morning before walking away. Around the auditorium, conversations centered on one topic. The keynote speaker was expected to unveil an entirely new computational architecture that many experts believed would redefine the future of artificial intelligence. Several technology journalists were already calling it the greatest breakthrough since deep learning. Just before the session began, the conference host, Dr. Emily Chen, reviewed the final presentation backstage. One of the organizers quietly informed her, "Professor Bennett has arrived." Emily's face immediately brightened. "He's here?" she asked. "Where?" He insisted on sitting in the audience. Without another word, Emily walked toward the entrance of the auditorium. Moments later, the lights dimmed, and nearly 1,000 attendees settled into their seats. Everyone expected the keynote presentation to begin immediately. Instead, Emily stepped onto the stage, looked across the crowded auditorium, then suddenly stopped speaking. Her eyes had found the elderly man quietly sitting in the final row. To the surprise of everyone present, she stepped down from the stage and walked the entire length of the center aisle. The audience watched in puzzled silence as she approached Arthur Bennett. Professor Bennett, she said. Thank you for coming. Arthur looked pleasantly surprised. I was hoping to listen quietly. Emily laughed softly. I'm afraid that's impossible today. Hundreds of researchers watched the unexpected scene unfold without understanding why the conference chair was greeting an unknown elderly visitor with such extraordinary respect. Emily then turned toward the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, before we discuss the future of artificial intelligence, she smiled toward Arthur. I'd like you to meet one of the people who quietly made that future possible. Complete silence filled the auditorium. Many younger researchers looked confused until several senior professors slowly stood to their feet, one after another. They began applauding. The applause spread throughout the hall as recognition gradually appeared on more and more faces. A graduate student sitting near Arthur whispered in disbelief, Professor Arthur Bennett. His advisor quietly nodded. The man whose mathematical framework most of us have been using without ever realizing where it came from. Arthur looked almost embarrassed by the attention. As he picked up his old leather briefcase to follow Emily toward the stage, the brass clasp unexpectedly slipped open. Several weathered notebooks became visible inside, each carefully labeled by year, stretching back more than 4 decades. Beneath them rested a single sealed envelope written in elegant blue ink. Across the front were only a few words. For Arthur, open this when people finally understand that the greatest discoveries belong to the future, not to the scientist who first imagined them. The auditorium remained completely silent as Professor Arthur Bennett walked slowly onto the stage, carrying his worn leather briefcase. Many of the younger researchers still looked puzzled. They had searched his name online only moments earlier and found only a handful of old academic papers published decades before most of them were born. None of those papers had ever become famous outside the research community. Dr. Emily Chen smiled as she looked across the audience. Many of you believe today's keynote is about a revolutionary new artificial intelligence architecture. She began. You're right. She paused before adding. But before we discuss where this technology is going, we should acknowledge where it truly began. Behind her, the giant screen changed from the conference logo to the scanned image of a yellowed research paper published 43 years earlier. Across the top appeared the title, Adaptive Hierarchical Learning Models for Distributed Pattern Recognition, authored by Professor Arthur Bennett. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Emily continued. At the time this paper was published, computers were slower than modern calculators. Memory was measured in kilobytes, and the hardware needed to test Professor Bennett's ideas simply didn't exist. She smiled toward Arthur. His mathematics arrived decades before the technology capable of proving it. Several senior professors quietly nodded. One of them whispered, We all studied that paper. Emily pointed toward a complex mathematical diagram displayed on the screen. Every modern researcher in this room has probably seen a version of this architecture. Another slide appeared beside it, showing the internal structure of the new AI system scheduled to be unveiled later that morning. The similarities were unmistakable. Layer after layer followed the same mathematical principles Arthur had proposed more than 4 decades earlier. One graduate student stared at the 2 diagrams before slowly raising his hand. Are you saying? He hesitated. Our new model evolved from his original framework? Emily smiled gently. Not evolved. She looked toward Arthur. It was built upon it. Complete silence filled the auditorium. Arthur quietly opened his leather briefcase and removed one of the oldest handwritten notebooks. Its pages were covered with equations, diagrams, and careful observations written entirely in blue ink. There were no computers in the photographs attached to several pages. Instead, there were sketches of circuit boards, handwritten algorithms, and notes describing ideas that the computing power of the early 1980s simply could not support. Arthur smiled softly. People often ask why I stopped publishing for several years. He looked toward the audience. The truth is, he gently turned another page. I didn't stop thinking. Soft laughter spread through the hall. Arthur continued. Sometimes science reaches an answer before the world has built the tools needed to verify it. One young engineer looked at the notebook in amazement. You wrote all of this by hand? Arthur nodded. Every equation. Emily carefully accepted another notebook and opened its first page for the audience to see. Instead of mathematics, it contained only a single handwritten sentence repeated at the beginning of every volume. Before asking whether your theory is correct, first ask whether nature has already answered the question. The room became quiet again. Arthur smiled as he watched hundreds of researchers reading those words. Computers calculate, he said gently. Reality decides. At that moment, one of the conference organizers quietly walked onto the stage, carrying a polished wooden case that had remained hidden behind the curtain. Emily accepted it with a smile before placing it on the table beside Arthur. Professor, she said softly, there's something we've been waiting many years to return to you. Arthur looked surprised. He slowly opened the case. Inside rested the original conference badge from the scientific symposium, where he had first presented his mathematical framework more than 40 years earlier. Beneath it lay a faded rejection letter from a major research journal that had once dismissed his work as decades ahead of any practical application. Resting underneath both documents was another sealed envelope written in the same elegant blue handwriting as the one inside his briefcase. Across the front were only a few words, "For the day the world finally discovers that time is often the greatest reviewer of scientific truth." The audience remained completely silent as Professor Arthur Bennett slowly lifted the faded rejection letter from the wooden case. The paper had yellowed with age, its edges worn from decades of careful preservation. Across the top was the date from 43 years earlier. Several cameras zoomed in as the large screen projected the letter for everyone to see. One sentence immediately caught the attention of the entire auditorium. The proposed theory is intellectually interesting, but has no foreseeable practical value with current or future computing technology. A quiet murmur spread across the hall. Doctor, Emily Chen smiled gently. At the time, she said, this was considered a reasonable conclusion. She turned toward the audience. Professor Bennett wasn't told his mathematics was wrong. She paused. He was told the future would never need it. Arthur folded the letter carefully before placing it back on the table. They weren't being unfair, he said calmly. They were judging yesterday's computers. A graduate student raised his hand. Did you try to prove them wrong? Arthur smiled. No. The room became quiet. Science isn't about winning arguments. He looked around the auditorium. It's about waiting patiently until evidence has a chance to speak. Emily nodded with admiration. While many researchers abandoned similar ideas after repeated rejection, Professor Bennett quietly continued filling notebook after notebook with new mathematical proofs. She opened one of the weathered journals. Every page contained handwritten equations, diagrams, corrections, and observations, dating across decades. There were almost no crossed-out sections. Instead, Arthur had written comments beside earlier ideas such as needs better mathematics, technology not ready, and try again in the future. One young engineer whispered, he never gave up. Arthur smiled softly. I simply ran out of reasons to quit. Gentle laughter echoed through the room. Emily turned to another page and held it up for everyone to see. In the margin, written nearly 30 years before modern AI became possible, was a single sentence. One day computers will learn from patterns instead of instructions. When that day comes, these equations may finally have a home. The audience stared at the words in complete silence. A senior professor quietly removed his glasses. He predicted this before most of us even had personal computers. Arthur shrugged modestly. I wasn't predicting the future. He smiled. I was waiting for it. At that moment, the conference hall lights dimmed slightly as the organizers prepared the keynote demonstration. The enormous display behind the stage came alive with a visualization of the conference's newest artificial intelligence architecture. Layer by layer, the mathematical relationships appeared on the screen. Emily slowly walked toward the projection. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, watch carefully. One by one, she highlighted the core equations powering the new system. Then, beside each modern formula, another equation appeared lifted directly from Arthur Bennett's handwritten notebooks more than 4 decades earlier. The similarities were undeniable. Hundreds of researchers instinctively began applauding before the comparison had even finished. The graduate student who had earlier joked that Arthur belonged in a museum quietly lowered his head in embarrassment. Arthur noticed and simply smiled. Don't apologize, he said kindly. Every generation mistakes old ideas for outdated ideas. He looked toward the glowing equations on the screen. Sometimes they're simply waiting for the right century. Emily then reached into the wooden case once more and carefully removed the second sealed envelope addressed to Arthur. She held it gently before asking, "Professor, do you think today is finally the right day?" Arthur looked at the familiar blue handwriting for several long moments before giving a small nod. Across the front of the envelope were written the words, "For the day, people finally understand that the greatest scientific discoveries are often recognized long after the scientist has stopped trying to prove them." Professor Arthur Bennett carefully opened the second envelope while the auditorium remained completely silent. The paper inside had become fragile with age, but the elegant blue handwriting was still perfectly clear. Arthur adjusted his glasses and began reading aloud. "Dear Arthur, if you are opening this letter, then the world has finally arrived at an idea that visited you many years earlier." He paused before continuing. "Do not celebrate because people finally agree with you. Celebrate because knowledge has found another generation willing to carry it forward." Every researcher listened without moving. Arthur turned to the next page. "Many scientists spend their lives chasing recognition. Do not become one of them. Recognition follows time. Discovery follows curiosity. If you must choose between the two, choose curiosity every time." A quiet stillness settled over the hall. Arthur smiled softly before reading on. "There will be moments when your work is ignored, rejected, misunderstood, or declared impossible. Never confuse rejection with failure. Sometimes the world simply has not grown into your ideas yet." Several young researchers slowly lowered their eyes, remembering papers that had been rejected or experiments that had failed. Arthur unfolded the final page. "One day, your equations may appear inside machines you will never build, in laboratories you will never visit, and in discoveries made by people you will never meet. When that day comes, remember that science has never belonged to the scientist. It belongs to humanity." Arthur quietly folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. No one spoke for several long moments. Finally, Dr. Emily Chen stepped forward and looked across the audience. "Professor Bennett," she said warmly, "every researcher in this room has benefited from ideas that began in your notebooks." Arthur gently shook his head. "No," he smiled. "They benefited because thousands of other scientists improved those ideas after me." Emily laughed softly. "Exactly the answer we expected." She then turned toward the audience. "The greatest researchers do not build monuments to themselves." She looked at Arthur. "They build foundations strong enough for strangers to continue building after they are gone." At that moment, the conference organizers unveiled a polished glass exhibit prepared beside the stage. Inside rested Arthur's faded gray wool sweater, his worn leather briefcase, the fountain pen he had used for decades, the original handwritten notebooks containing his earliest mathematical models, the first rejected research paper, the 2 letters from his mentor, and the conference badge from 43 years earlier. Above the display, illuminated by soft white light, stood a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "The Arthur Bennett Scientific Legacy," dedicated to the researcher who taught generations that great discoveries are measured not by when they are accepted, but by how many futures they quietly make possible. The audience rose together in a long-standing ovation. Some applauded the remarkable career of a pioneering scientist, others applauded the mathematical foundations beneath modern artificial intelligence. But those who truly understood what had happened that day realized they were honoring something even greater. A man who had spent more than 40 years believing in the truth of an idea, even when almost no one else could yet imagine the future in which it would finally belong. The story of Professor Arthur Bennett quickly spread throughout the international scientific community. At first, news reports described the emotional moment when a conference chair stepped off the stage to greet an elderly man sitting quietly in the last row, wearing a faded wool sweater. But as researchers learned who Arthur Bennett truly was, the story became far more than a touching reunion. Universities, research laboratories, and technology companies realized that one of the mathematical foundations supporting their newest artificial intelligence systems had been proposed by a scientist whose work had spent decades quietly waiting for technology to catch up. 1 year later, the National Academy of Engineering invited Arthur to deliver the opening lecture for newly elected research fellows. Hundreds of computer scientists, mathematicians, AI researchers, engineers, doctoral students, and university professors filled the auditorium, expecting a presentation on advanced algorithms or the future of artificial intelligence. Instead, Arthur walked onto the stage carrying only his worn leather briefcase. He slowly opened it and removed the oldest of his handwritten research notebooks. Looking across the silent audience, he smiled gently before reading the first sentence written on the opening page more than 40 years earlier. Before asking whether your theory is correct, first ask whether nature has already answered the question. He quietly closed the notebook again. People often ask me how it feels to have my work recognized after so many years. He began. The truth is, he smiled softly. The mathematics never cared whether anyone applauded. The audience listened without moving. Equations do not become more true because they become popular. He rested one hand on the notebook. Sometimes they simply wait for the world to become ready. Complete silence filled the hall. Arthur continued. The greatest danger in scientific research is not making mistakes. He looked around the room. It is becoming so eager to publish quickly that you stop asking whether you have truly understood the question. Dr. Emily Chen, seated in the front row, quietly smiled. Those words reminded her of the morning when a humble old scientist had taught an entire conference that every revolutionary discovery begins long before the headlines appear. At the conclusion of the ceremony, the National Academy unveiled the Arthur Bennett Center for Foundational Artificial Intelligence Research, established to preserve the history of the mathematical ideas that quietly shaped modern AI. Inside the center rested Arthur's faded gray wool sweater, his worn leather briefcase, fountain pen, the original handwritten notebooks, the rejected research paper, his conference badge, and the 2 letters from his mentor. Visitors expected the first exhibit to display complex algorithms or sophisticated computer systems. Instead, they found a single handwritten question displayed beneath soft lighting. Have you understood the question before trying to answer it? Every new doctoral researcher entering the institute was asked to spend several minutes reflecting on that sentence before beginning their first experiment. Years later, after Professor Arthur Bennett peacefully passed away at the age of 94, scientists from around the world gathered to honor him. There were no speeches celebrating awards, citations, patents, or famous publications. Instead, one by one, researchers quietly placed handwritten notebooks beside his portrait, promising to continue asking better questions before searching for better answers. Above the entrance to the Arthur Bennett Center for Foundational Artificial Intelligence Research, a bronze inscription welcomed every future scientist with the words that would forever define his legacy. Technology transforms the world. Curiosity transforms technology. The greatest discovery is often the question that no one else thought to ask. Those who visited the center often admired the old sweater, the weathered briefcase, and the notebooks that had survived more than 4 decades. But those who truly understood Arthur Bennett's life realized that his greatest contribution had never been inventing a famous algorithm or inspiring a single conference. It was teaching generations of scientists that the strongest foundations are often built quietly, long before anyone realizes they have been standing on them all along. The story of Professor Arthur Bennett soon spread far beyond the conference hall in San Jose. At first, newspapers described it as the touching moment when an elderly man wearing a faded wool sweater was unexpectedly honored before hundreds of the world's leading artificial intelligence researchers. But as universities, technology companies, and research institutions uncovered the full history of his work, the story became something much greater than the recognition of one forgotten scientist. It became a reminder that the greatest breakthroughs in science are often built upon ideas whose creators never lived to see how far those ideas would eventually travel. In the years that followed, Arthur Bennett's story was shared in engineering schools, computer science departments, research laboratories, and technology conferences around the world, not because he became famous late in life, not because his mathematical framework helped shape modern artificial intelligence, but because he proved that genuine scientific discovery is driven by curiosity rather than recognition. Whenever young researchers asked Arthur how he remained motivated after decades of rejection and silence, he always smiled before giving the same answer. "I was never trying to become ahead of my time," he would say. "I was simply trying to understand something that would still be true after my time had passed." During his final public lecture at the International Academy of Science, Arthur walked onto the stage carrying the same worn leather briefcase that had accompanied him throughout more than 40 years of research. Instead of displaying complex equations or advanced computer simulations, he quietly removed a single blank sheet of graph paper and held it up before the audience. Hundreds of scientists, engineers, doctoral students, and professors watched in complete silence. Arthur smiled gently. Every great discovery begins like this, he said. An empty page. He paused before continuing. The page doesn't care who fills it. Soft laughter spread across the auditorium. Arthur looked around the room. Nature doesn't reward the loudest scientist. He smiled. It rewards the one who asks the question everyone else forgot to ask. Carefully placing the blank page back inside the briefcase, he spoke one final sentence that would later be engraved above the entrance to the Arthur Bennett Center for Foundational Artificial Intelligence Research. The future is rarely invented by the person who receives the applause. It is often prepared by the person who quietly writes the first equation. The audience rose together in a standing ovation. Years after Professor Arthur Bennett peacefully passed away, his faded gray wool sweater, worn leather briefcase, fountain pen, handwritten notebooks, rejected research paper, and the 2 letters from his mentor remained preserved inside the research center that now carried his name. Above them hung a simple bronze plaque that every young scientist read before beginning their first research project. Never measure an idea by today's technology. Measure it by whether the truth it describes will still exist tomorrow. Visitors often admired the remarkable history behind the mathematical foundations of modern artificial intelligence, but those who truly understood Arthur Bennett's life realized that his greatest achievement had never been creating equations that changed computing. His greatest achievement was teaching generations of researchers that recognition may belong to history, technology may belong to progress, but curiosity belongs to every scientist willing to continue asking questions long after the world believes there are no answers left to find.